Hello there, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 1.2 in our development unit entitled, How is Development Measured? So, by the end of our lesson today, you should be able to explain four different models or methods, that are used to measure development. And the four that will be mentioned in this particular video are GDP per capita, the Gini coefficient, the Human Development Index, or HDI, and the Happy Planet Index, or HPI. So, gross domestic product is one of the methods that is used to measure development in global politics. So, what exactly is gross domestic product, or GDP? Well, the GDP is defined here: the monetary value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. So, what this means is that everything within the United States that is manufactured and built and made within the border of the United States, and all of the goods and services that we transaction with within each other. So when we go to Burger King or McDonald's and buy something there, that transaction is calculated as part of America or the United States gross domestic product. So when you look at, you can calculate all of that. This currently, the U.S. gross domestic product is $21.4 trillion. So that is how much money is made or produced within the United States. It's $21.4 trillion. On the flip side of the same coin of GDP, the little tiny country of Bermuda, their GDP is only 7.4 billion. So keep that in mind. $7.4 billion is the GDP of the nation of Bermuda. Okay? Just in comparison to the United States. Now, I know what you're thinking. When you look at gross domestic product and you're comparing the United States and Bermuda, yes, the United States is whoppingly way huger. There's no question about that, and no one would argue that. However, when you're trying to look at GDP in terms of development, you need to look at something a little bit deeper. This is something called GDP per capita. Okay? And so when you look at GDP per capita, what you're doing here is that you are dividing the GDP by the population. So, yes, the United States is enormous in terms of its GDP with 21.4 trillion. But our population is also 330 something million people. So when you divide that 21 point trillion, divide the 330 plus million people that live here, our per capita GDP is $65,134. So that means on average, everybody in this country should be making, $65,134. We all know that's not actually really, the case, but our country, based on that, if everything was divided evenly, would roughly be that. However, when you look at Bermuda's GDP and its GDP per capita, when you divide its population by its gross domestic product, per capita is $117,768. So basically, more people in Bermuda are making more money than they would if they lived in the United States based on just the sheer size of the population. Take a look at these two charts here. So now understanding the difference between GDP and GDP per capita, look at this question. How might this affect these rankings? Just, stop here and pause for a moment and think, how might GDP and GDP per capita, how does that affect these rankings in any way to you? So, what are the limitations of using GDP? Well, first of all, there are some good things about GDP. GDP does measure income and it does measure growth. So, it does show us if your country's moving forward or if it's falling behind. So, that's very easy to calculate and measure. However, what GDP does not show us is that it does not show us equality. So just because, as we know here in the United States, yes, we have the highest GDP of any country in the world, but that doesn't mean that all of us are making $65,000 a year, as you well know. It also does not measure destruction. It doesn't show, even though the country may be rapidly developing, it doesn't show what they're doing to the environment. It doesn't show what their environmental footprint is and how rapidly they're deteriorating their own forests or whatever. It doesn't show social cohesion, so we don't know exactly if this country is politically stable. They could be economically moving forward, but politically fracturing. And again, going back to environment, we do not know what they're doing to the environment. So GDP only shows us if they're growing or shrinking. It doesn't show us any of those other things that are essential to understand in terms of development. Knowing what we know about GDP per capita, that it doesn't show us anything at all about uh, how fair or equal distribution of income or anything are, geopolitical scientists have developed something called the Gini coefficient to address that. So, what is the Gini coefficient? The Gini coefficient is designed to measure how equal or unequal a society is. So, those questions that the per GDP per capita leaves unanswered, like about, you know, well, how equal, well, biggest one is how equal or unequal this particular society is. GDP per capita doesn't answer. The Gini coefficient tries to answer that question. So when calculating the Gini coefficient, the ranges are just 0 to 1. So it's only, a 1 point scale here. And if you are getting closer and closer to 1, this represents perfect inequality. So this means that you're getting where basically the haves have everything and the have-nots have absolutely nothing. So this will be perfect inequality. And then if you're getting closer and closer to 0, this will be perfect equality, where everybody is perfectly sharing everything. Now, the Gini coefficient measures differences between incomes of the richest and the poorest, and then how many people earn how much on that particular spectrum. So they try to plot things all along these particular curves here to try to figure out where nations and different groups of people lie. And of course, the Gini coefficient is used to complement the overall data picture that is provided by GDP per capita. So this is like another extra step of analyzing that GDP per capita data to get a better picture of exactly, while this country may have a high GDP and be relatively decent with GDP per capita, that does not mean that it's necessarily an equal or unequal society. Here is a map showing you the Gini coefficient comparisons across the globe. So the next method that's used to measure development often is something called the HDI, or Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index is a composite statistic of life expectancy, education, and income per capita indicators, which are used to rank countries, and there are going to be 4 different tiers of human development. So the HDI actually has 4 different subcategories that it analyzes its data, and it places countries in along those scales that they measure and they use all 4 of these to calculate the HDI score and then rank the country accordingly. So the Human Development Index considers things like health, education, and income in a country. So not just looking at GDP and things like that, then they're looking at things like access to healthcare, access to education, free and quality education, and then how much income is evenly distributed among people. So again, this is going deeper into understanding human development. Here we list a few advantages and disadvantages of the Human Development Index. Some advantages include it is a composite indicator that contains 3 elements, better than just looking at money. So it has 3 different categories, that we look at and analyze. So it's not just looking at the income. It allows comparison between regions and countries. So you can actually look at, as opposed to GDP, they actually analyze their data along different types of regional and national agendas. It's been around since 1990, and it allows temporal changes. So, as the world changes and things like that, the Human Development Index can grow and ebb and flow as well. And it allows for analysis of different components. Some disadvantages: it does not take into account environment. Looking at China, yeah, China is doing great, economically, but its ecological footprint is terrible. Data could be unreliable, and it can be incomplete, and sometimes can be unavailable, because remember, you're relying on countries to provide this information for you, and oftentimes you can't really get it. And it's an average and does not show internal disparities. So again, it doesn't go deeper into the country. It does not measure factors like human rights and those kind of things, and it doesn't. Literacy measurements changed actually in 2011, so it's if you're trying to do comparisons and literacy rates, it's now much harder to do that if you use the HDI. And lastly, we have our Happy Planet Index, or the HPI. And the HPI is defined here. It measures the extent to which countries develop long, happy, sustainable lives for the people that live in them. So if you think about it, that definition even makes me kind of happy. So, draw a little happy face there. So using Happy Planet Index, it's really, they are trying to measure how well a country is doing and trying to deliver a happy, sustainable life for their citizens. So the index uses global data on life expectancy, expected well-being, and ecological footprint to calculate. And of course, in this particular map here, green is the happiest countries, and brown are the least happiest countries. So, just give you a moment to reflect on that. So this graphic here just shows you how HPI is measured. You do not need to know this for any type of an exam or anything like that, but this is just, breaking it down for you. So if you want to pause and read it, you're free to do so. If not, you can just skip it and move on. Now this explains to you why Happy Planet Index is a useful measure. So take a moment to pause here and read this and absorb the information that you have in it. And there we have it, end of lesson 1.2, how is development measured? So can you explain 4 different methods used to measure global development, such as GDP per capita, the Gini coefficient, the Human Development Index, and the Happy Planet Index? If you can, give yourselves a round of applause, pat yourself on the back, because you have done a wonderful job and have mastered 1.2. So at this point, make sure you have gathered up all your notes and that you've got all the notes you need from this lesson, and look for any activity for lesson 1.2 and complete that, and then move on to lesson 1.3 if the video is uploaded for you. Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful day.